So, are you ready to get serious about fantasy? Because it's about to get real. We're getting into Stephen Erikson's massive Malazan series. Now, I realize that it's probably supposed to be pronounced Malazan. At least that's what I've heard that Erikson himself uses as far as pronunciation goes. But the audiobook narrators that I've listened to for all of these books, I've always said Malazan. So I'm probably going to be saying that. Forgive me. But in any case, will you like it? That's why you're here. You want to know, will you like it? Number one. Number two, what is my story and psyche take on this? How does this reflect the psyche? Because I keep saying that it does, fantasy in general. And how does it? Or maybe does it even? So let's get into it. The story opens several years into a series of wars by the Malazan Empire to conquer the continent of Genabacchus. This is where we start in Gardens of the Moon. There's a commander named High Fist Dujek One Arm, and he is in charge of this expansive attack on the continent. And there's only two cities left that are resisting the Malazan Empire. One is the city of Pale, and the other one is Darujistan. This story drops you right in the middle of this conflict. And there's a siege going on right at the beginning. And it's the siege of the city of Pale. And what's going on is Pale is trying to hold out, and they are succeeding against the seemingly unstoppable empire because they have an alliance with this character named Anamander Rake, who is the Lord of Moonspawn. Anamander Rake is a Tista Andi. That is an elder race, kind of an elf-like race. In this instance, more like a dark elf. And he is in charge of this army of other beings like himself who live in a floating fortress and command massive magical power. So with a guy like that on your side, I guess you could even hold out against this massive empire. In any case, the battle is ferocious, but Rake withdraws his forces and the Malazans achieve a victory. However, it's a Pyrrhic victory. And the legendary elite unit known as the Bridge Burners are, for the most part, decimated, except for a handful of survivors. And some within that group speculate that this was by design. All this happens within like the first couple of chapters. So I'm not even touching the surface of all the stuff that happens in this book. And so it goes on from there, incorporating ancient elf-like elder beings, more than just Statista Andi, floating castles, intrigue upon intrigue, shifting alliances, demons, undead warriors who once ruled the world, wizards who travel through interdimensional warrens, sometimes into even eldritch swords. Yes, they travel to inside the sword, which has its own interdimensional space, and all kinds of weird crap happens in there. In this story, you have dozens of characters and viewpoints, all scrambling about in this tangled plot of conflicting desires and deeds, ranging from underhanded and treacherous to noble and honor bound. So the question you may be wondering is, will you like it? Well, here's some points to consider. First is that the pace. The pace in this story and the subsequent series of books, which I'll be individually reviewing as well, is quick and dense. Erikson does not hold your hand. He expects you to keep up. And the style is also very cinematic, meaning that the shifts in viewpoint are kind of like shifts in camera angles. And in fact, as I understand it, Erikson originally pitched this idea as a movie script. And you can definitely tell it in his style of writing. It's very quick paced. He's shifting viewpoints. It's mostly action based. He doesn't dive into the characters, which I'll get into in a minute, super deep. That's not to say the characters aren't interesting. They are. But there's a unique spin that he takes on this. In fact, it's kind of like Dune. If Dune was pure fantasy and if Dune sequels didn't get so bloody weird. Now, no, that Gardens of the Moon is definitely weird. But it never reaches that level of weird, like God Emperor of Dune weird. And it's nothing like the weirdness of a Voyage to Arcturus, like that I've reviewed on this channel here also. It's just really wild in that it's extremely high fantasy and he leans it hard into it. Now, as I was mentioning, Erikson often gets criticism for his characters being kind of difficult to relate to, maybe somehow lacking depth. Library of a Viking, another booktuber, fantasy booktuber, for example, has tried nobly several times to get through this book, but couldn't. And this was his main complaint. Others have voiced a similar complaint. And I can kind of see this, but at the same time, I do believe that this was a stylistic choice on Erikson's part. He does not linger on inner thoughts and conflicts very much, not as much as other authors, but he does do it some. But other characters come through, basically, the characterization comes through the actions of the characters and the sheer outrageousness of their presentation. That's what makes them compelling. So I think the criticism of them lacking depth and all that is very unfair. Nevertheless, I can kind of see it if you're not used to that style, or if that style just does not really vibe with you very much, and you want to kind of dive deeper and spend more time with a smaller number of characters and kind of get in their head and really understand their point of view. This may not be the book for you if that's what you're looking for. Nevertheless, there are some great characters, and just scene-chewing characters. Anamander Rake, which I mentioned before, is a great example. He is so extreme. Now, you don't get any scenes from his point of view, but it doesn't matter, because as soon as this guy shows up, you're wondering what in the heck is going to happen now, because he's so ludicrously overpowered. And he's just so mysterious and powerful. The cool factor is like 11 with this guy. And so you're just really wanting to know what's going on. You never find out anything about what's from his own point of view. And I've listened to some podcast interviews with Erikson, and he did this deliberately. And I think it was a very good choice myself, because this character would be so difficult to get into the head of. He's countless eons old, and he's extremely super powerful. It would be really hard it'd be like scenes from Gandalf's point of view, right? How does that work? Then there's some other characters too. Kruppa, for example. And again, there's probably 15 different ways to pronounce that guy's name, but he is so weird, and he's so seemingly completely nuts. But then after a while, of course, you realize that maybe he's not quite as nuts as he looks like on the surface. And there's definitely more going on with him than meets the eye. But again, Erikson lets you come to that conclusion, right? He doesn't spoon feed you anything, which I really like. If you want, however, deeper immersion into the psyche of the characters, you will probably be annoyed. In fact, you may even feel as though Erikson is keeping all of the characters kind of at arm's length, and you never really get into their heads like you do in, say, Abercrombie, for example, which is very different style. I also appreciate Abercrombie's style as well, but I do get what Erikson is going for here too. So I think it's not either or, really. It's both and. I like the different styles. So consider that. Also consider there are constant viewpoint changes and head hoppings from one scene to the next. Often in a single chapter, you'll see many, many, many different characters' points of view. And it's also spanning large spaces as well. And I mean, talking dozens of characters. So it's going to be hard to remember them all. This may frustrate you. It really didn't frustrate me. I really kind of like that. Just drop you in the middle of all the chaos and you're scrambling to try to keep up and figure out what's going on. I kind of like that. It's challenging, it's fun, it's interesting, and there's so much going on that you're never bored, right? You might, some people complain that they can't get into the characters and that makes it impossible for them to enjoy what's going on. I guess I'm just not that kind of reader. Here's another thing to consider as whether or not you'll like it is, do you like military fantasy? And like, this is to me the paragon of military fantasy that I've read so far anyway. And I know there's others out there, but think Black Hawk Down or Saving Private Ryan, if it were set in a fantasy world and you had demons and ancient sorcerers who could turn into dragons. It's really, really interesting mixture of extremely gritty, in the sense that Erikson doesn't shy away from gore or sexual assault or dirt or muck or slime or anything. And that is juxtaposed in the exact same scenes with the pure wildness of the magic and the monsters. They're just thrust right into this hyper gritty, ground level soldier's eye view of things. And you're just constantly hit with this super gritty, never glossing over or, prettifying anything. And then on the top of that, you've got this world shattering magic that's happening at the same time. Okay, what about the imagery? So the imagery on my Sando Peak scale lands right around the 4 or 5 range, I think. Erikson doesn't linger on long, rich descriptions, but at the same time, he doesn't leave it to bare bones either. He strikes, I think, a good balance, especially given how much plot he is jamming into the story. I think if he did actually get a chance to make a movie out of this, it would probably have to be about 5 hours long. But I don't think it would have to be longer because much of the story is very heavily action based. And so what you're getting are scenes of intense action, which a movie would be able to handle relatively quickly. Whereas a lot of times in books, you get tons of, in-depth character analysis and development and, deep dives and all that kind of thing, which would eat up tons of screen time. So just what little I know about translating books to movies and vice versa, actually, I think this one wouldn't be as bad as a lot of books. Now, most of the time, like I said, you're immersed in action, 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 adventuring, shifting here and there, going into these magical warrens, exploring ruins, infiltrating the undercity of Darujistan, and so forth and so on. So think about that. Like that's another thing to think about here in the imagery and the pace and the tone. The magic in this. All right, last piece of this, what to consider. The magic, it's super powerful. It's not explained in much detail, and you kind of have to just go with it. I actually love that. What I didn't care as much for in that is that by necessity, this magic being so commonplace and so super powerful, you really couldn't describe it with the sense of wonder and awe that I often love in fantasy, especially fantasy that has high magic in it. I mentioned Abercrombie before. That's extremely low magic. And when it is appearing, you do have that kind of sense and awe and wonder, but for the rest of the time, you really don't have much at all. So I don't know that that's necessarily a great compromise, in my opinion. But in any case, having you be gobsmacked by the amazing wonder and awe of magic would not have made much sense in this. So that's why Erikson doesn't do it. So it makes perfect sense. Instead, he unleashes the magic. Everyone just has to deal with it. Everybody pretty much knows more or less how it works. And so it's not treated as out of the ordinary, really. So your magic is kind of commonplace as a result. And at the same time, if you're looking for long, in-depth explanations of how the magic system works, you won't get this here. He has no time for such stuff. He's got way too much things to do to be bogged down by that. Now, some people don't like that. Some people want something like what Sanderson does often, which is describe and explain the intricate mechanisms of the magic system in fine detail. In fact, he's the one who coined the phrase magic system, I believe. Although you could also look at that from the point of view of RPGs, which have had an immense influence on the fantasy genre. I've definitely seen that in my lifetime. What about the story in the Psyche piece? Okay, this is the kind of the piece that I can kind of offer myself. Of the books that I've read so far, Gardens and all of the Malazan books have a very heavily allegorical bent to them. Erikson tells an action-packed story with dozens of characters, but he is in part deliberately crafting the story to also reflect things that have either gone on in the world or are going on right now in both the past and the present. Okay. Now, he's not doing this in a super systematic way, but it is there. Now, when I say not super systematic, meaning that you don't get a strong sense of coherence to the story, and I'm pretty sure he does this on purpose. He knows what he's doing. So when he breaks the rules, so-called, he does it for specific reasons. And for me, it still works. Now, you can tell that he based these stories on a role-playing game. I think it was the GURPS game that he and Ian Esselmont played, back in the day. Because sometimes the plot feels like it unfolds via D20. In other words, you're going along and then just something completely seems like out of nowhere happens. Now, it's not that it doesn't make sense. It does. It's just that it's definitely, you never know what's going to happen next, which is it's a great thing about these stories. You can go into it and you have absolutely no idea where it's going or what's going to happen. But however, that can be very disorienting for some readers. Nevertheless, So from a psychological point of view, it definitely puts you in the shoes of the character. So I think it, in many ways, that style of plot helps to offset the fact that he's jumping around with so many different characters that we don't get deep into their minds and their immersive worlds as much. So now, at the same time, on top of that, he inserts elements that are deliberately symbolic of our own world and our own human tendency to undermine ourselves and betray our own most treasured values. But he's never really heavy-handed about it. And even the so-called random elements here still have they give this story a strong sense of authenticity. Like you're living in this bonkers world, trying to get through the day, and you never know what's going to happen next. In this sense, it is very dreamlike, but it mimics more the dreams of people going through a stressful and chaotic time right now, rather than the dreamlike nature that you'd see in a story told by someone who went through all this stuff a long time ago, but has now sat back and reflected and understands the deeper meaning of it, if that makes sense to you. So now, big part of this is that I'm only talking about book 1, and this is book 1 of 11. So we may get to that stage at the end. I don't know. I've finished the Bone Hunters, which is book 6, just yesterday. So I was excited to get started on these reviews because I want to keep doing this. Now, this also resembles more of a culture dream in the sense that you don't have one person as like the main focus. There's no main character here. There's no Frodo Baggins or Dayraven like you might see in Way of Dan. What this does to the story is it makes it kind of bigger, but at the same time, maybe a little bit less intimate. It's a trade-off. Some might find this as a drawback. I'll leave that to you. Getting through all the mayhem just to ask yourself, what in the heck was the point of all that, may be a drawback for you. Now, I think Erikson is really not interested in giving us an answer to that question, at least not in book 1. On the other hand, you could say in the face of gods and immortals and magical beasts, maybe the best thing you can do is just sort of get through it in one piece with as much of your sanity and self-respect intact as possible. That might be the theme of it. Thus, the themes, therefore, I think technically wouldn't necessarily qualify so much as themes as potent subject matters deserving of comment, which he definitely does. And when we get to Deadhouse Gates, we're going to have definitely some more to say about this. In any case, I think Erikson is kind of deliberately bending the rules here. He's clearly aware of them and is choosing not to tie everything into a nice, neat bow in terms of theme, where each character reflects the theme. That works really well in shorter stories, but in this case, I think he's deliberately saying, you know what? There's more chaos in here than that. There's more chaos in real life than that. And you're just going to have to deal with it and roll with it. Now, does this mean that at the end of the day, like at the end of book 11, that we might not, that we won't see him tying everything together? I kind of think he probably will, but I guess we'll leave that. But even if he doesn't, it's okay because he's getting across a strong feeling, right? And this is the way the theme is coming across in a way really can't be verbalized that easily. Excuse me. So then what would I give this in terms of a rating? Definitely 5 Dreamstones out of 5. I loved it. I love the completely bananas fantasy, the intense action, the unpredictability, and the just massive scale of it all. And the fact that every time you turn around, there's some new crazy thing happening that, like, whoa, what is that all about? The characters are really fun, not because they're super complex or deep or that you're diving into their psyche and their, experience and all that, but rather because many of them are so over the top, or they're just so super like gritty and real feeling that you kind of can't help but kind of get into it. In a lot of ways, this reminded me of an old board game called Divine Right. And any of you grognards out there, you might remember those overly complicated and completely bonkers fantasy board games from the 70s. This definitely gave me that same vibe. And for all I know, Erikson may have played that game back in the day. He's definitely the right age for being right in the middle of all that. So that's what I got for you. I will review the rest of the Malazan books as I go. I just finished book 6, like I said yesterday. And in any case, be sure to check out my own fantasy novel, King of the Forgotten Darkness, first of 9. And that is available now, and you can see the link below. And until then, I will see you later.